Welcome to the Be Ruthless Show, where we have the conversations that other people don't, the conversations that other people won't. I'm your host, Sam Ruth, and I'm ready to make a lot of noise and disrupt things, ruthlessly. Thanks for being here today. Now let's get to it. Welcome back to the Be Ruthless Show. I'm your host, Sam Ruth, and joining me today is Sarah Gaer, a suicide loss survivor who holds a master's degree in clinical mental health. She spent the past 10 years working in suicide prevention focused on men in their middle years and first responders. Sarah currently works as a consultant in suicide prevention and trauma recovery and is spearheading long-term recovery efforts at Holyoke Soldiers Home, which experienced a mass casualty event during COVID-19. Sarah also holds a contract with the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, creating and providing training for law enforcement on topics such as suicide prevention, toxic stress, and resilience building. Sarah is also a national trainer for psychological first aid. She authored the novel The Price, which chronicles the suicide death of a police officer, as well as co-authoring Guts, Grit, and the Grind, which is an anthology series about men's mental health. Sarah has also published a children's book, Goodnight Grace, which assists families and caregivers in talking with children about their parents' substance use disorders. That's a lot. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
How did you get so passionate and involved in this very difficult field?
I mean, like for so many other people, right? My personal lived experience played a real role in it. I was right on the brink of graduating with my associate degree when I lost my best friend, who was actually my third friend to die by suicide. And so, you know, I didn't want to take the job I had been offered at a residential program. I felt like I can't do this. And my mother, who was an absolutely brilliant woman, said, you know, you can always quit later. Just give it a try. If it's too much, you can always quit later. And once you get your feet in the work, at least for me, it was like, I can't quit. How can I quit? And so it started, you know, 1998. And as you dig deeper, and you know this because you're in the work, the more you dig into each one of these topics, the deeper they get, and the more you realize how impactful they are. And so one thing just sort of spiraled into the next thing. I never thought I would be in suicide prevention. I definitely thought that was way too close to home. But then I was the team leader for a FEMA-funded crisis counseling program responding to tornadoes. And I fell in love with the program that managed the contract, and I begged them to keep me. And the manager said, well, I do have a job. I was like, okay. He's like, it's suicide prevention. I was like, oh. And then he says, and men in the middle years. And I'm like, oh. And you would have to travel the entire state of Massachusetts. And I was like, oh, this is starting to not be that appealing. And he says, and we're not going to pay you very well. Sold. I mean, honestly, Samantha, I thought I would do it for a couple of years, learn as much as I could, specifically about suicide, because as somebody fresh out of my master's degree, suicide was really intimidating. And the next thing you know, I ended up in it for 9 years and have continued now on my own in it. So that's the long backstory to how I ended up in this field.
Which is so amazing, because there are people who steer away and think it's too deep or too heavy and just avoid this population. It's not easy work. And it's not easy work with anyone, but men are a special type of creature that are bred to keep things in and not talk about their feelings. So it's really a tough population, but so needed. So thank you. And men, first responders, it's all this target audience of people that are told to do otherwise, to shake it off. And I love your mom for saying you can quit later, because we're not told that.
Right. And you know, the funny thing, when you mentioned the anthology that myself and Dr. Sally Spencer Thomas and a comedian named Frank King, which we were quite a trio to be working on that project, you know, that was all born from that idea and that belief that men can't tell their stories, right? And, you know, I was having this experience day after day after day working with predominantly first responders, mostly firefighters, where they'd come through my training, they'd be stoic, they wouldn't, it was very hard to get them to engage with me. And I had been told, you're going to love this, no matter what, never let them see your weakness, right? So here I am, and this is how it translated into my mind, right? Is here I am, I'm walking across the parking lot. I have this big box filled with all the papers, and my Dunkin' Donuts is balanced on my head, trying not to drop anything. And they would ask me if I needed help, and I was like, nope, I'm good, right? I can't show you my weakness. And all of a sudden it hits me. I am doing exactly what we don't want them to do. So I made the decision that the next time somebody asks me, even if I don't need their help, I am going to accept it. So a training wraps up. I did not actually need their help, but one of the firefighters looked at me and said, do you need help with your box? And I said, yes, I do. So we walk out to my car. He's carrying the box. I open my trunk. I turn to take the box, and he looks at me and says, my daughter's been cutting herself. Do you think she might be at risk for suicide? And it was this like aha moment, but also, kind of devastating. How many times had I shut down the opportunity for them to talk to me one-on-one by not accepting their help? And so day after day, I accept their help, and they tell me these incredible stories standing in the parking lot. And I think to myself, I wish that this guy today could have heard the guy last week. So I go to Sally Spencer Thomas. I said, Sally, I have this crazy idea. What if we collect stories from these men and we publish a book? And that way, we're not trying to get them to come out and tell them in public, face to face, which can be really intimidating and vulnerable. So we put out a call for submissions. Samantha, we're planning to do one book, right? We're going to do one book, take us a few months, easy peasy. We had so many submissions that our book was going to be over 700 pages and grew into 4 books. And so, I keep saying in this work, yes, these men have been acculturated to believe that they can't talk about it. And it's hardwired in a lot of ways, but we shouldn't let that stop us from creating the avenues, because they will surprise us. And so
true. So unbelievable. I'm close friends with a sergeant. He's high up in Detroit firefighting. And we laugh that one of the reasons we connected is because we just took the time to say, hey, how are you doing? We're both in these fields where people come to us for help. And if we don't volunteer or say, I'm not okay, not everyone stops to check in. So just giving them the time opens the door. It's not having to have this big lecture prepared or the perfect answer.
Right. It's just seeing each other as people.
What do you see as far as the people who do approach you? The people who I connect with are also actively working to create change in the departments and bring in more mental health support. So I feel like they're waiting for us to say hello and to do something, because we don't know what to do and what politics to pursue to make changes. They certainly don't, but there are people receptive to the fact that they do need support.
I think it's been such a difficult political landscape for the last several years, and there's been a lot of us and them, and so I'm obviously I'm a bystander, right? I'm not an us and I'm not a them. And, so for me, I have that privilege of being able to stand sort of on the outside and observe from, kind of that higher, removed place. But what's really, really jumped out at me is that we are all people. And the firefighters, especially the law enforcement who I spend most of my time with now, they want to go home to their families, and most of them, look, I will not say anything to you I don't say in front of them. There's good people and bad people in everything. There's good teachers, there's bad teachers. There's good mental health counselors, there's bad mental health counselors. There's good police officers, and there's not such good police officers, and at the end of the day, we're doing an awful lot of othering. And I just feel like there's no pathway forward in that, right? And so I see my role as trying to bridge these pieces as much as I can, and the first step for me is humanizing the officers and saying, look, I don't know, I can't say I know, but I see what you face. I hear the hardships that you're up against, and the frustration and the sadness. And, they're not only up against their jobs, which are incredibly difficult, but they're also up against the entire criminal justice system, which often isn't working in their favor, and they get blamed for things that they're really not accountable for, such as, a violent criminal who keeps getting out of jail. Well, the officers did their job. They arrested that criminal. It was, the larger system that keeps letting them out. And so I really start off by saying, I see you as a person, and also that humility, right? I don't know your job. I don't know your story, but I want to understand it. And people are so relieved when you just see them as a person.
We live in this culture of drive-throughs and Amazon and instant gratification. Their job by design is right on to the next thing. It's go, go, go. The first crisis might not even be over with, and they're called to another. And that is not mentally healthy for anyone, even if it's just your chores piling up. So letting the world know that we have to allow time and space for them to process these things, telling them that it's not only okay, but necessary. Do you face resistance to those conversations from some?
Here's what I've learned. I'll tell you, if you don't mind, can I tell you a quick story?
Yes, please.
So very early in my work with first responders, I mean, here I am, I'm obviously female, I'm in the mental health field, right? So people see me as being part of the hug squad, and I'm doing a suicide prevention training in the fire service. And I have this one person in the back of the room. He's got his arms crossed, his chair's tipped back. He's like clearly mad. He's forced to be there. And everything that I say that's even remotely empathetic, compassionate, sensitive, he grumbles at. Audibly, he grumbles. You can't help but know he's there. And at the end of the training, everybody clears out and he starts to walk towards me. And I mean, Samantha, he's got the mad walk. And I'm like, oh no, where is this headed? And he goes, I have a question for you. I'm like, oh no. And he says, do you think there's ever people who don't want to die, but don't want to live either? And I'm like, why is he so mad asking this question? It's a great question. And why is he so mad? And I said, yeah, actually, we know that for a lot of people who are experiencing suicidal intensity, that's exactly how they feel right up until, moments before they make a suicide attempt. He goes, yeah, well, I feel that way every effing day of my life. So obviously we're going to work with that, and we're going to work to get this person the help that they need, right? But what I learned in that moment is that the people who are that resistant, who are that angry about having these conversations, are often, if not always, the people who you're hitting a raw nerve. They've lost somebody they cared about to suicide, and their coping mechanism has been anger. They are struggling with it themselves. So I have learned that resistance is an opportunity. And I also have learned, don't take it personal. So often in our work in particular, right, it's taking it personal that gets us, that blocks us from being able to do what's most important in the moment. So yes, I definitely do come across that resistance, but the way that I perceive that is this is hitting a nerve for this person.
And I'm so impressed with Massachusetts just from connecting with you and hearing all of these supports. It is different depending on the state you're in. And we shouldn't have to think about, I live here and I want to have this job. Is that safe? Is that healthy for me? And it really makes a difference. Colorado's mental health is so far from where it needs to be. And they're just creating the first co-responding team with mental health staff added to the force. And I thought of that and the progress for the victims, for the 911 calls, for the people that will have more support. But now I'm thinking about it in terms of the officers, because they also are living in this culture that isn't providing support.
Yeah. And you know what? When we get really lucky, the officers will even tell you that the co-responding clinicians, that those are their buddies. And so I think, it's really important to see that support is absolutely doing wonderful things in the community, because you know what? It's not rewarding for the officer when they're in a situation they have not been provided enough in-depth training on how to manage it, and they don't feel that it was managed right, but they weren't given the skills to do it, in a more effective way. So now when they have that co-response with them, it's significantly more rewarding because they're seeing better outcomes. So really it's a win-win. For us to be working together, and that's not the work that I do, but it's happening in lots of the departments I work with. I think for the most part, it really is a win-win.
And it's interesting you say that. When I first saw that this was happening in a town near me, I was so excited that I had moved to Northern Colorado and immediately started contacting the people named so that I could be a part of it, learn more. And it was not the mental health professionals returning my calls. It was the chief of police. So grateful. And I'm not used to that here. That's my experience in Michigan. In Colorado, I haven't been met with happiness or excitement that someone's interested in joining. And so to have people saying, we're so glad you see the value in this, opens the door for so many things. And they're not trained. I'm imagining, I see little kids having anxiety attacks and teachers don't know what to do. And they're scared of a child acting out. Well, police are seeing these people with guns and weapons. And even if it is mental health, they're reacting to their observation. And it is frightening if you don't know what to do.
Right. Well, and the other part of it is I've had lots of law enforcement express deep sadness over the way they feel the community sees them. And I think that getting into the academies, which again, I don't want to brag too much, but in Massachusetts, they're doing a lot of work right at the academy level, so that we're catching people before they get out there, before they're doing the work. But it does make people sad that, it makes the officers sad that I walk in the room and sometimes instead of people seeing me as help, they're afraid of me, and so there's a lot of good work. In Massachusetts, we have a long way to go. I mean, this is a system that's been fractured for a very long time. It's not, even those states that are really progressive in the work, I think we feel like we have a long, long way to go, because it's not just about getting the law enforcement in a better place. We have to get the whole mental health system in a better place, right? So, for example, I teach question, persuade, and refer, the QPR. And ideally, we know from a mental health perspective, we don't want to force everybody into the hospital. That's not always in fact, not only is it not always helpful, in many instances, it's actually harmful and traumatic for people, right? But then there's the liability of the system. So where a law enforcement officer may feel like, I don't know that this is the right step, but they don't have a choice because of the policies, right? And so those are some of the places, instead of us holding the law enforcement directly accountable for everything, you're right, we have to look at some of those underlying policies that really tie their hands. And also, when something goes wrong, them being held accountable for it. Right? Like, we can't have it both ways. We can't want them to be able to make decisions, but then always hold them liable if situations didn't go the way that we wanted them to go. And I know for men in the middle years, hospitalization is truly a last resort. And I honestly believe that for everyone, but it really puts law enforcement in a hard place when they're working with mental health crisis.
That's so true. And I have always seen police as help, but the majority of people are in my world who are not breaking laws or doing anything wrong. They have that negative response. And for any officers or first responders listening, when I first moved to Colorado, my one-liner always was, I'm not fighting the government. I am not going to bust my butt to make change here. I'm just one person. And I want to say to you that one person connecting with one other person can make a huge difference. There are so many mental health professionals that want to collaborate and work together to solve these problems. And if you're in a state like I am, where the law's too much, reach out to someone individually, because maybe the two of you can come up with something, and people see you as an alliance. When I go into the schools with an officer, they're not afraid of that officer.
Right.
And I'm not doing anything. I'm just visibly there. But it creates an entirely different interaction between them. And when the conversation starts without fear of, I'm getting arrested or I'm getting my locker searched, the whole flow goes a different direction. So I do think that even though the door is shut in my face all the time, I'll keep going into stations, because if there's one officer that says, let's figure out a way to do this, that makes a difference in that community.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of it is learning, I learned early on, you have to strike when the kettle's warm, not hot and not cold. And so, oftentimes in our field, we tend to strike when it's hot. Something horrible has happened and the mental health field sort of rushes in, and it's not the right moment. We have to be there before that moment. We have to have built that relationship before the kettle's that hot, or we wait too long, the kettle's cold, people have sort of forgotten how much they needed that support. So it is building these relationships is tactical, but it's also, you have to be really authentic, and it takes time for them, whether it's the people in our community to build that trust or for law enforcement to trust us. It just takes time to build those relationships.
Yeah. And I'm shifting a little bit, but I'm thinking of your books, and we're talking about suicide, but then you go to substance abuse. And I feel like there is a large issue with first responders that alcohol is a release. There's a lot of substance use. Is it healthy? Are we talking about, is it healthy to drink when you've been through something so traumatic? Are those things being addressed for the young officers coming in?
I don't work in the academy, so I can't tell you what those curriculum look like, but I can tell you when I do training with law enforcement about trauma, especially I talk a lot about the acute stress because there's no denial in that, right? They all know that after something really horrible has happened, they're probably not going to sleep. There's a good shot they're going to have night terrors. So starting there is often really helpful. And then the other thing that I do is I do call it post-traumatic injury, right? I call it an injury. We would never look at somebody who got hit by a car and think they were weak because their leg broke, right? And we know the more that we understand the way that trauma impacts the brain, really is an injury. And in some cases that injury will heal itself very quickly. In fact, in most cases it will. But we want them to know what it's going to look like, when they have sustained injury, like you said before. Oftentimes they're on to the next injury before they've had even a moment to think about the first one, and so I talk to them and explain, here is how that alcohol is going to impact your brain. I'm not here to be an anti-drinking person, nor will it be effective. And by the way, once they shut you out, you're out, so don't do it. But the approach that I really take is, look, as miserable as that acute stress is, we want your brain to be able to process it. And if you add alcohol to that, it's going to delay and sometimes stop that ability for your brain to process it. And what that means is that the injury can become more significant and longer lasting. So as miserable as that acute reaction is, we need you to go through it. And then I talk to them about, like, okay, now it's been a couple of weeks, it's been a few weeks, what's that going to look like, right? Where can we turn? And thankfully there are resources out there that are specific for law enforcement. There's peer support, there's critical incident response teams, but we want you to know that if you come forward and say these things are happening to these groups, people are going to recognize that there's an injury, and they're not going to look at you as being weak, broken, any of those things that you think they're going to think.
But some people in the rest of the world might.
Well, and that is why peer support, Samantha, I can't strain enough the importance of having peer support everywhere in every field, because being able to talk to somebody who's been through it is just, it's so, so, so important. Not only because I don't have to explain all the ins and outs of what I'm experiencing, I can just tell you what happened and you already understand it, but also there's a sense of trust that you're going to hold my confidence. Here in Massachusetts, peer supporters are bound by confidentiality. I don't know that that's true everywhere, but here it is. So that's another thing that's really important, is having that network for people.
And it's so true. I am a widow. I've worked with trauma, loss, and grief my entire career, and obviously became more experienced with it when I lived it. But I'm looking to hire and add someone to my team who's lost a child. And my dad said, why? you have a very impressive resume. Like, he didn't understand. And I said, I can. And I have clients who have lost children, and I do the very same work, but I cannot connect with them without words. I cannot know in the same way. And it's important and it's valuable for them to have both. It's not one or the other. We have to find the people who really get it, because it truly is an understanding without words. I can call anyone who loves me and they know I lost Jim and I'm miserable and I need support. But if I call another widow, I do not have to say anything. Right. So if you're listening, even if there's not peer support available, finding someone you feel comfortable being real with and having that real talk is something I can't put a price on. It's the most valuable thing. And I know it's really scary when you're in the middle of it to think about letting someone in, but it is the biggest gift you can give yourself. And I love that the book was designed for children. And I asked the question because I feel like the way you were talking about it for law enforcement is the same way you would with children.
Well, it's really interesting. So the way that book is Goodnight Grace, and I have to tell you, all of these things came out right at the beginning of the pandemic. And so I've done no marketing on any of them. But Goodnight Grace actually came to me because I've worked in trauma response for a really long time. And one of my friends took custody of her niece. And it was her niece's 10th birthday. And biological mom, who has a substance use, significant long-term substance use problem, which is why aunt has this young child, did not come to the birthday party. She didn't show up. And so my friend, who's a wonderful person, just like incredible, didn't know how to have a conversation with the little girl. And interestingly, this 10-year-old, because children are brilliant. I don't care what anybody tells you, they're brilliant. This 10-year-old had been watching a documentary, you're going to be just amazed, on kids with addiction. And after watching this documentary, she looks at her aunt and says, "Is my mom an addict?" She was able to piece these things together. And my friend sort of panicked, didn't know how to maneuver the conversation, and calls me. She said, "Can you come and talk to her?" So I go over there and I'm having a conversation with her. And I said, I heard you have some questions. We had this really long conversation about what addiction is. And then she looks at me and she said, "Sarah, is my mom going to die?" I'm like, oh, I mean, this is a 10-year-old, right? And I hear my old supervisor, who is one of my lifelong mentors, who used to say, children never grow up, and thank you for lying to them. And as much as I don't want to answer this question, I realized the importance of it in the moment. And I said, I hope not, but she might, right? And I'm like, I'm holding my breath, waiting for the tears or the anger or whatever. And she goes, "Okay, do you want to see the coloring that I did for my new book?" And I thought, yes, I do. Oh my God, yes, I do. I want to see that coloring so badly right now. So anyway, I walked away from it and I thought to myself, if it's this hard for me, someone who's been in this field for a long time, who has, some specialty in substance use disorders, to have this conversation with this little person, what's it like for the average family? But, Samantha, the other part of it that was so important, this child, like so many others, was internalizing her mother's behavior. In her world, my mother doesn't love me, and therefore it must be something's wrong with me. And so when we think about upstream suicide prevention, that is upstream suicide prevention, helping a 10-year-old understand that her mom's behavior is not because of her. Her mom's behavior is because her mom is sick. That can help prevent that child from later developing all sorts of other problems, including substance use and suicidal intensity. So Goodnight Grace is really, in my mind, it is an upstream suicide prevention book to help children who are dealing with parents who have major substance use issues, and to help the families be able to be honest with those children. So that's what drove it. And I think that it's really important. I do want to tell you, the child who this book was written was well aware of the book. She was the first person to get a copy of it. And I said to her, "Nobody ever needs to know that this is your story." Well, didn't she bring the book into school the next day and tell everybody? And so it really, I think storytelling not only helps the listeners, but it can be really empowering for the storytellers too. For her, it was, my sorrow can help another kid.
I think that's true of healing. I didn't start writing to publish books, right? I was getting through my pain. And so what I find the most wonderful part of this story is that you told her the truth. And substance abuse is not a life of honesty. I'm the child of a recovering alcoholic, and I knew when people were lying to me.
Right.
So even though she didn't say thank you for telling me the truth, I know I was that little girl, and having someone not treat you like an idiot, you're 10, but you're not dumb, right? Like that's also really important. And my brother, I tell this story often, so sorry to the listeners who have heard it. My nieces lost someone on their mom's side, and he didn't want me to talk about it with them. Mm. And I struggled being in a different state. The minute I got there, both of them, but especially my youngest, who was about to be 10, immediately, it was one of the first things they wanted to talk about. And they wanted to show me the stuffed animal they sleep with, that they talk to, because that's Uncle Herb. And they know that I'm a safe person that they can have those conversations with. And my brother just sat back and watched and was like, well, I just learned a whole lot. Like, clearly it was my issue, not theirs. And so bringing in someone to just help me with this conversation, we don't always have the magic answers. We sit there and go, oh my God, am I going to devastate this little person? But it gives them comfort to have the conversation honestly. And whether it is a child or a first responder, people need the truth.
Right. Yeah. And, I also found that there was some resistance to the book. That resistance often came from people who wanted to protect the parent. And my answer, with all due respect, is we have to start protecting children. And maybe if we had protected that parent when they were a child, that parent wouldn't have grown into having the problems that they have. But we have a responsibility to protect children and to be honest with children. And I have lived with whatever resistance and anger. I've had predominantly parents with substance use problems who were actually very angry at me for writing this book. And I said, I'm sorry. I understand that this is uncomfortable and you feel like your authority has been violated. My goal is to help that child.
Are these available on Amazon? Where can people find them?
Yep. You can find Goodnight Grace on Amazon, the Guts, Grit, and the Grind series. We have 4 books. It took us, I think, almost 5 years to get them all out.
Is that with Frank King?
I'm sorry?
Which one is with Frank King? Because he's also been on this show.
Oh, Guts, Grit, and the Grind is with Frank King.
Okay, wonderful.
Yep.
I didn't know there were 4. That's amazing.
Yes. And, we really had a great time writing those. It took us a long time. It was a lot of work, but when we were doing our market research, we were asking the men, because I really believe in going to the source, what do you want in your resources? And they said, one person in particular said, I want a manual. I want something, I'm not going to read a book cover to cover, very honest. I want a manual. I want something where I can flip to the back of the book, look up whatever the problem is, and then go to that thing. And yes, I want to hear from the experts, but I also really want to hear from everyday men like me, how they did it. So after that conversation, I got into my car. At the time, it was a Volkswagen Beetle, and I pull out my car manual. And can I just tell you, that car manual was actually what we used. We ended up picking up more car manuals, but as sort of the foundation of the whole project. The other thing that we found out really interesting is men are not our target audience to purchase this book. And we knew it writing it. Women are going to buy the book. Women are going to buy it for their partners, their sons, their friends. We recommend leaving it in the bathroom, on the back of the toilet seat somewhere, where people can sort of glance through it in private, because mental health does still have all of that sort of fear producing, but the stories are phenomenal, Samantha. The things that these men openly talk about in these books, one of our writers talks about, the day that his father murdered his mother and how he survived that experience. I mean, the stories are truly phenomenal, up to and including making suicide attempts. So if you look at the books, the first one is blue, and that's our overview. So it's a little bit of each book into one. And then our green book is our upstream. So that's really looking at general maintenance. Here's how we prevent ourselves from ever needing an overhaul. The yellow book is our midstream. So that's really looking at like, okay, the road's getting bumpy. We want to do a little bit more in depth. And then our red book is that overhaul. That's our sort of life has hit a real crunch and we have trouble brewing, and how do we deal with that? So that's looking at addiction, trauma, and suicide. So I'm very, very proud of all of them, but more than anything, I'm proud of the storytellers. It's one thing to go out on a podcast, right? Or to do these types of things, but to put it in black and white and to publish it for the whole world to see, potentially forever, is such a phenomenal level of courage, that I'm just so proud of our storytellers. And one of the things we didn't anticipate, we should have, because we know this, but we didn't. One of our storytellers came to us and said, I don't know that I should do this because my life is still hard and I'm still struggling to figure it out. And we said, you absolutely should do this, right? Like, no, we're not looking just for those, fairy tale honeymoon stories. We're looking for the real truth and the hardship and how you keep going. And a few months later, we touched base with him. We said, how are things going? And he actually cited that writing his story down changed the trajectory for him, that it really helped him to put all the pieces together in his own mind. So I'm super proud of that project in a lot of ways. But the storytellers are phenomenal. And anyone who's interested, you can follow Guts, Grit, and the Grind on Twitter. You can find Guts, Grit, and the Grind on Facebook. It is truly, really a special project.
And I want to say two things to everyone listening. One, you don't have to write in a book. If you are struggling right now, and this is resonating with you in any way, you can write in a journal and you can burn it if you don't want. There is something therapeutic about getting it out on paper. So consider that a first step. And to the men and business owners and corporate people listening, we write these books, we target men, and women are still the ones buying the books. So if you have a company with men and they can benefit from this, that's a way we can make a difference also. Why are the police chiefs and the fire chiefs not saying, oh my God, I need this for the entire department? So if you're listening and that's you, that's another suggestion politely over here to get this into the hands of the people who need it in hospitals everywhere. There's not anyone in this world that will not go through losing someone to suicide or knowing someone who has lost someone to suicide. That's the world we live in. So this manual sounds incredible. Thank you. Will there be a fifth? Is it continuing?
Oh, no. I have one more book that I'm working on, and I have not committed to actually pushing it over the finish line. It is based on my own suicide loss. So it is very near and dear. It's been much harder to write than all the others for me personally. So we'll see what I do with that one. But I'm also working, I don't think we talked about this. I'm actually doing a lot of work. You're gonna probably take a deep breath on the soul. And the reason is that, I've realized that in the mental health field, we have put ourselves in a silo. And, we're very guilty of talking all our mental health jargon that often just sends other people running. And we haven't done a very good job listening to folks who aren't part of our field. And so I really wanted to start to think about the language that we're using and how we are and are not connecting to the people that we're here to help. And one of the things that occurred to me is that the word soul is something people talk about all the time. So in my presentation, I have like quote upon quote, Helen Keller, Martin Luther King, Joe Biden, right? Like just all these people who talk, sort of loosely about this idea of the soul. So I started doing some unofficial and then more official research around it. And what we found in work that I did with Sally Spencer Thomas is 90% of people connected with the idea of the soul. And so we started digging deeper into like, what does that mean? What does the soul mean? And it does mean something a little bit different for different people. For about half the people, it's sort of that part of us that lives beyond death. It's the part of us that connects to a higher power. It's got a spiritual connotation to it. But for the other half, it doesn't necessarily. What it does mean across the board is it's the real me, right? And so I'm having conversations with people about how is the real you being impacted by this experience, right? So if it's not depression, if that doesn't fit for you, if anxiety doesn't make sense for you, right? And I actually had a farmer say to me once, and it really hit. He said, "Look, just because I'm depressed doesn't mean I have depression. Let me tell you what's going on in my life." And I couldn't argue with him, Samantha. I was like, "Yeah, right." And so I have created this concept. I'm not the first one to use the term, but the concept itself is mine, which is of soul exhaustion. And what I love about it is, one, it resonates with lots of people that mental health language doesn't resonate for, but the solutions, are a lot deeper. So it's really looking at things like making meaning. The big one I'm really passionate about right now is finding forgiveness. Forgiveness for others, asking for forgiveness when we've made a mistake or we've hurt someone. And maybe the most important is finding forgiveness for ourselves. So I'm really excited about this, and that might be the next book on the line. But I haven't started it yet.
Fascinating and so true. Working with first responders, they gave me feedback that safe space wasn't drawing anyone in. And they asked, what do you mean by that? And I said, no judgment, like no critiquing. So we changed it to a no judgment zone. The language matters, and we get caught up in the words we use, but making a little change to help your audience understand, and even considering reading a book that might use a word but has some value in there also, is really important, because until someone pointed that out, I wouldn't have known. Right. So let us know. I want to know the words that turn you off, that make you not want to read the books. And I also want to touch, you said writing your own story has been a little bit harder. To everyone listening, death by suicide is different than just awful death. It really is. It's not talked about. There are stigmas in this world. So how do the people struggling get that support when they can't even talk about it openly?
Yeah, it's really interesting. When my best friend died, she had been 21 years old for 6 days. I tell the story in my work very, very, very frequently. She died on her 7th suicide attempt. And so for me, I had experienced about 5 years of anticipatory grief. And it was really interesting because here I'm a kid, right? And yet I seem to be the only one who feels like she's going to die by suicide. She is going to kill herself. And to have to sit in that for so long, and the powerlessness of that, and the fear of that, for me, when I finally got the call that she had died, there was a moment of relief, because for 6 years I had dreaded that call, and at least the worst thing that could happen had happened. Like, I don't have to fear the worst thing anymore. But because I wasn't family, which back in those days when they said suicide loss survivors, it really only meant family, I did not feel that I could access the supports that were out there. So after about 9 years, and I will tell you, the term soul exhaustion was actually born, in a sense, out of my suicide loss, because it was so hard to describe to anyone what it was like to go through losing specifically her, but all of the suicide deaths I had had. It was so devastating that in some ways I no longer even knew who I was, right? I had lost, any belief that I could help somebody, any belief that I could protect people, it was all shattered completely. And so there was this phenomenal level of soul exhaustion, which led to all sorts of not good things, by the way, right? I gained almost 60 pounds the first year after she died. It was pure and complete exhaustion. And so after about 9 years, and I'm going to date myself here, I was searching on Yahoo. Can you believe this? and they had Yahoo groups. So just for ha-has, I looked up suicide, and they had a Yahoo suicide loss group. So I sent an email to the person who ran it, and I remember saying, she was just a friend, because I always felt like I had to preface it, right? I'm not family, she was just a friend, but my life has never been able to move forward. I cannot recover from her death, and I don't have anywhere that I belong because she was just a friend. And immediately they accepted me into this group, and I introduced myself as she was just a friend. And all of these people came forward and said, there's no such thing. Your life was touched. Your heart was broken. This really matters, right? And so this group embraced me completely. And it was really helpful because it was pretty anonymous, right? It was all by email address. So there was no Facebook profile picture. There was no Twitter handle. It was just an email address. And I'm going to tell you, the first year that I was part of that group, I had more healing than I did the first 9 years after she died. And so I want to shout out to everybody. There are so many different types of peer support out there, whether it's a Facebook group or it's something in Twitter that you're following. Go out there and look for it. There is, in my view, and I had an amazing therapist. I don't want to discredit what she did to help me, but nothing helped like peer support did, nothing. So, go out there, find what fits for you, find what's comfortable and where you belong, but you will not, in my view, be picky, because there's definitely groups out there that I have left. But nothing can heal the heart better than being with other people who've lived through it.
She's just a friend. Just that I hope everyone listening connects to that in some way, because people do compare losses and minimize their own pain because we think someone else's is bigger, and it is not about that. Your pain is yours, it's real, and it matters. And finding people who get that and don't make you feel like you have to put it in a different place is so key. And if you are an in-person person, there are groups that meet in person. If you're nervous and not sure how to start, maybe looking online is a good thing, but whatever feels right for you is right. There's absolutely no one way. And that's why I smirked when you said somebody wanted a manual. If we could only give a manual that told us what to do, no one would be in pain. So finding those people is so huge. And I know it's overwhelming, but you give yourself that one step. I'm going to do this one thing, and look at the relief you had immediately. People instantly started telling you things you wouldn't have heard otherwise.
Yeah. And, Samantha, I would just like to give a shout out for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, who does run lots of those groups, but also for a lot of people, the Out of Darkness Walk, it's a place to come to honor your loved one, because oftentimes we're met with judgment towards our loved one. People wanted me to be mad at her. People wanted me, they wanted to tell me how selfish she was. And all that did was hurt more, because I loved her and she was beautiful and she was in horrible pain. And all that said to me is, you don't understand what I've lost. So that Out of Darkness Walk is such a powerful place for you to meet other people who have lost loved ones to suicide, and get it. So, please think about doing that. It's also meaning making, right? Get a team together, bring people out to raise money for AFSP. So not only are you meeting other people who've experienced loss, but you're also making meaning out of that loss.
And that, like you, I didn't plan to be doing the work I'm doing. I was just getting through my pain, and it somehow led me to doing this and being able to help others. All you have to do is get through it and survive. You don't have to know what you're doing it for. I really, truly didn't know I was writing to continue writing. So whatever gives you relief, decreases pain, find those communities. Thank you so, so much for being here, Sarah. You can connect with Sarah at Gaer, Gaer.com. Any final thoughts for everyone listening?
Just take good care of yourself. The world is really hard right now for all of us. And I think I hear people say COVID's over, and it's not over for everybody. I work in a facility where, we're still dealing with this pandemic and it's still impacting people's lives on a day-to-day basis. But there's so many other things that have happened to all of us in the last 5 years, 3 years. We've had protests, we've had people killed, we've had murder hornets, right? It's a lot of stress. So shut off the news and do something to take good care of your heart and your soul. Number one is connect with the people that matter the most to you, because we get so wrapped up in all this social media, and we forget sometimes who we really want to invest our time in. Somebody said to me, Samantha, and this has really, really resonated for me, time is our most powerful currency. It's the one currency that nobody's ever going to add more to your account, no matter what. And we should all think a little bit more about how we're spending it. So that's my final thought.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being so real, for doing the work that you do, and for making time today. Thank you so much. Everyone listening, until next time, always be ruthless. Thanks so much for listening today. Your support means everything to me, truly. If this podcast resonates with you, please do me a favor and join in the Ruthless movement by making some noise and doing one of these 4 things. Subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Tell a friend so we can break stigmas even faster. Leave a review so people can see what you think of the show. And last, if you want to learn more about me and be a part of the Grief Hab community, please head on over to the Facebook group. We'd love to have you. Thanks again for spending your time with us, and see you next week.